AStewart, I've known for quite a long time, is a senior lecturer at Sussex University. He's done lots of research on various sorts of ecology, community ecology, but he's also a national expert in hemiptera, little bug, and is chairman of the Royal Entomological Society Conservation Committee. And he's going to talk to us today about his recent work he's been doing on glowworms, which I deliberately left out of my talk. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Matt, and indeed thank you to the excuse me, the organisers of this meeting for inviting me to give this talk. So I want to pick up, of course, where Matt left off, and really concentrate in detail on one particular insect species, and that is the glowworm. At the risk of insulting your knowledge, I should say at the outset that glowworms are not worms, they're beetles, and they're recruited from the family of beetles called the Lampyrids, which include things like fireflies, which we don't have in this country. They're mainly tropical things, although there are some in America. We have probably 2 or 3 species of glowworms in this country, but 2 or 3, a couple of them are really very rare. So we only have really one very common species, and that's the Lampyris noctiluca, common glowworm. And the interest from the point of view of today's proceedings, of course, is that these things communicate with each other, males with females, using bioluminescence. Now, glowworms are really, really attractive species for a lot of people. Up and down the country, you will find people running glowworm walks and talks, which are very well attended, and people come back from those walks with sort of words like enchanting and mysterious and magical and so on. People really, really are fascinated by glowworms. I heard a quote the other day. Somebody referred to glowworms as earthbound stars, which I thought was quite a nice one. But they're very, very charismatic and very, very popular organisms. I just want to say a little bit about sort of background before I go on to talk more specifically about potential effects of light pollution. Glowworms have a 2-year life cycle, which is a little bit unusual in insects. They start out as eggs, of course, laid down in the litter or on the soil surface. They then hatch as tiny, tiny larvae. You can see a tiny one there sitting on the back of a much larger larva. So the small one will be one that's just hatched, and the larger one that it's standing on will be one that's about to pupate. So that gives you a sort of idea of the range of sizes. And these things are predators. They feed on snails. They inject a venom into the snail and then a proteolytic enzyme that dissolves the tissue, which they then sort of scoop up. So they're quite important predators of snails. And then on the right-hand side there you can see a couple of pupae before they eventually emerge as adults. But it's the adults that we're really interested in from the point of view of today's proceedings, because there's this huge difference between the males and the females. So the males look pretty much like your average beetles, really, with these long elytra or wing cases that cover fully functional wings underneath, and indeed they fly very readily and very powerfully. On the other hand, the females are wingless. They have no wings at all, so they have very, very limited powers of dispersal. The other very interesting difference between the males and females is the size of the eyes. You can see from these electron micrographs below. The female eye on the right here is really quite small underneath this sort of protective shield, whereas the eyes of the males are enormous by comparison. And the reason for that, of course, is that the males need to be able to see the females glowing. It's the female that glows in order specifically to attract the male to mate with her. So the females produce this sort of pale green glow through this process of bioluminescence, only when it's fully dark, fully nocturnal, and basically the males sort of, if you like, cruise around looking for females, using these very powerful, very large eyes to try and detect them. Once a female has attracted a male and they have mated, essentially the function of the glowing activity is then redundant. So she stops glowing, crawls down into the grass, lays her eggs and dies, and that's the end of that particular life cycle. And the bioluminescence itself, as you possibly know, is a very efficient form of light production. Very little of it is wasted as heat, and it's essentially produced by the bringing together of these two chemicals, protein called luciferin, with an enzyme called luciferase. Now, lots of 10 or 20 years, people have talked a lot about whether or not glowworms are actually declining. This was a paper that Tim Gardner and John Tyler published a few years ago in British Wildlife, asking that very question. And frankly, it's a difficult question to deal with, really, because most of the evidence is fairly anecdotal. But on the right-hand side there, you can see a distribution map. The open circles are the pre-1980 records, and the closed or black circles are the post-1980 ones. And you can see with sort of fair degree of confidence that there's quite a large number of areas where glowworms seemingly have been lost. So there does appear to be some evidence that they are in decline. Quite what the reasons behind that are is very unclear. A lot of the usual suspects to do with habitat change and so on, wholesale destruction of habitats, deterioration in quality of habitats and so on, and particularly, of course, in relation to the very poor powers of dispersal of females, fragmentation of habitats is likely to be particularly detrimental. Some people have suggested pesticides might be important. Frankly, I don't think there's much evidence one way or the other, with respect to this particular species at least. But it's light pollution that is often quoted, rightly or wrongly, as a possible reason for the fact that glowworms seem to be declining. And this has sort of caught people's imagination to some extent. There's a couple of clips from broadsheet newspapers over the last few years. I think glowworms going dark all over Britain is a bit of an overstatement, but nevertheless it reflects a sort of general perception that there might be something happening. And this has been partly at least reflected in some planning decisions that have been made at a local council level. So, for example, on the left-hand side here, this is a site just outside Brighton where the local rugby club wanted to put up floodlights around its practice pitch and was asked to direct them specifically away from an adjacent glowworm colony and also turn them off after a certain time of night. And on the right-hand side there, you can see somebody fitting some sort of baffle to the street light, again, specifically to try and direct the light away from a local glowworm colony. So there is the perception that some of these things may or may not work. So actually, whether that is a real effect and whether glowworms are responding to artificial light is quite a difficult question to unpack in many ways. Obviously, we need to know whether they can see those particular spectra. We need to know whether they actually respond to those spectra, and we can test that in the lab. We need to take that out in the field as well. If they do respond, then are there direct fitness consequences as a result of that? In many cases, I don't think that we necessarily know the answer to that. And if there are fitness consequences, can we chase that through actually to real effects on populations? That's the real challenge. So some of the possible mechanisms that may affect males, first of all, we know that they are attracted to certain light sources. They are regularly found in moth traps, for example, that come to people's windows if they're lit at night and so on. And it's very possible that they are repelled by certain wavelengths of light, and that may be some sort of barrier to males dispersing. It's possible that their circadian rhythm and the time of night at which they search for females and so on may be disrupted in some way. We have very little information about that. And of course there is also the possibility that they simply find it difficult to detect these very tiny little females glowing against a much broader, highly illuminated background. So any of those could be actually affecting what the males are doing. So what we've done over the last few years is firstly to look at the spectrum that the female produces, and that solid line there is essentially the female emission spectrum, which peaks at about 545 nanometers, so it's a sort of a pale green light. And not terribly surprisingly, The male response spectrum very much mirrors that in the sense that it peaks at about a similar sort of wavelength. We've tested, as you might expect, the fact that the response to each of these different wavelengths increases with intensity, which is exactly what you would expect. But very interestingly, what we have found is that there is some sort of inhibition going on at short wavelengths. So, in other words, down here, at sort of about 475 nanometers, at the blue end of the spectrum, what we're getting is some sort of antagonistic interaction between the different photoreceptors, what the vision neuroscientists call chromatic opponency, suggesting that there is something going on there that is inhibiting them at those shorter wavelengths. So it appears then that the males are very, very finely tuned in terms of their photosensitivity to the specific spectrum that the females produce. They clearly have, as a result of that, some sort of fairly primitive, possibly, color vision. But most importantly, they do appear to be inhibited by these shorter wavelength parts of the spectrum. And of course, it's that part which would worry one most in terms of the potential impact of artificial lighting, because of course the modern forms of lighting do very much stray into those shorter wavelengths. What we also found, we've done some cross-sections of the male glowworm eye, and what we have found is that there is a section of yellow pigment in the sort of the front and the top of the eye, which presumably filters out some of those shorter wavelength light beams. Quite what the function of that is, we're not sure, but what's very interesting is that it is absent in the lower part of the eye. When you consider that male glowworms are sort of flying around looking downwards to try and detect the females, the fact that that yellow pigment is absent in the lower part of the eye may be quite significant. Switching now to females, we know that the female glowing behavior is very, very light dependent. They only start glowing when it's very, very dark. And that's shown in this slide here, where the red star there is maximal darkness. So the females initiate their glowing at around or just slightly before that stage. So therefore their initiation of glowing may be delayed if there is a lot of extraneous lighting, or indeed may be completely inhibited altogether. We know, of course, that bioluminescence, the production of light, is metabolically very costly, and the longer that you have to do that, because you haven't yet been mated, you haven't attracted a male to you, the more you're going to use up your energy and resources, and the more you're going to lose weight, and that's what's shown in that graph on the right-hand side there, some quite old data. And of course, in comparison with the vast majority of insects, body weight is very strongly correlated with egg load. So the lighter that you become, as a result of having used up all your energy, the fewer eggs you will lay, and ultimately, therefore, that will reduce your overall fecundity. It's shown on the diagram on the bottom right. So, what conclusions can we make? Well, we know that males can see very definite parts of the colour spectrum, particularly that yellow-green part that the females produce, but possibly others as well. We know also that the males are inhibited by these short wavelengths, and that might be a considerable worry for us in terms of the kind of lighting that's being developed and more widely used these days. And what we now need to do essentially is to try to work out whether males are confused, if you like, in terms of trying to detect females when the background area is very strongly lit. That's something that we want to try and test this coming summer. We also need to do some work on the response of the glowing females to different light spectra, and again we're planning those sorts of experiments this coming summer. And if there is an effect on females, then clearly that might chase through to effects on fecundity, which ultimately, of course, could have really quite important consequences for populations. So quite a lot of questions, most of which we haven't yet answered, but we're working on it, as they say. And if there's any of you in the audience from the lighting industry who would be interested in any sort of collaboration on any of this, I'd certainly be very interested to chat to you afterwards. But thank you very much.